Terrific.
Welcome to our weekly Zoom news conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. This week, our focus is on domestic violence, also known as intimate partner violence, which has risen dramatically amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Frustrations over job loss and income insecurity have contributed to a spike in domestic violence cases, according to the New England Journal of Medicine. 1 in 4 women have experienced spousal abuse, while 1 in 10 men are also victims of partner abuse, according to the journal. Moreover, calls to domestic violence hotlines have dropped as victims fear exposing themselves in their households. Domestic violence shelters are at capacity and are not accepting new clients for fear of infecting existing clients. This morning, psychiatrist and author Ravi Chandra will tackle the difficult question of why men become abusers. Hani Tran and Joanna Taiban Dot from the Santa Clara, California District Attorney's Office will discuss how victims of domestic violence can access legal help and the procedures for doing so. And Fawn Jade Kaur, a senior attorney with Bay Area Legal Aid, will talk about why the legal system and law enforcement often fails the victims of domestic violence. On behalf of Ethnic Media Services, a special thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation for supporting our weekly briefings, to our veteran reporters, Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji, for coordinating our Friday Zoom calls, and to our interpreters, Oscar Artete and Jackie No, who provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. We will send out a video of today's call along with extensive bios of each of our speakers and additional collateral material at the conclusion of today's briefing. Now I turn the conference over to our moderator, Sunita Sarabji.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you all again after the Thanksgiving holiday. We start today's call with Dr. Ravi Chandra, a psychiatrist here in the San Francisco Bay Area, who will talk to us, attempt to explain why it is that abusers abuse. And Dr. Chandra, in our pre-brief, you mentioned that it is not only men who abuse, and so I would like to say that as well. Dr. Chandra.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to go at a bit of a different angle and read my statement, but I think the question is broader than why do men become abusive? But we live in a culture of abusive power where abusive power is given far too much license and is yet hidden in the shadows. So as you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist, writer, and compassion educator in San Francisco. And my most pertinent current writing is for Eastwind E-Zine, where I am writing from my corner of the intersection of Black and Asian lives in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and so many others. The Black Plague of the 14th century was thought to be caused by a miasma of noxious vapors. And the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and surfacing racial trauma have an underlying aggravating cause: the miasma of narcissistic, self-centered, tribalistic personality and culture. We can no longer think we can stave off the effects of this miasma with sweet and superficial flowers held to our nose as we carry on business as usual. President Trump is an extraordinary example of individualistic, antagonistic, aggressive, self-centered, masculine power. And my personal opinion is that he is an abused child who has grown up to abuse others, a clearly misogynistic and racist leader who has been accused of inappropriate behavior and assault, including rape, by over 24 women. He has used his power and influence to avoid the justice system. It should give us great pause that 72 million people voted for him, a clear indicator that abuse can get a bye, a wink, and a nod from all too many of us. This is not surprising for those of us who come from households where family members looked the other way or denied abuse by a parent, spouse, or caregiver. We are all affected by a culture that deems money and power, especially masculine power, as more important than relationship and compassion. Indeed, compassion and common humanity become the bad objects of a culture of abusive power. Compassion and common humanity have been subordinated and under assault for the last 5 years. For the last 5 years, we have all had a taste of what it's like to live and even be incarcerated in an abusive household, and how difficult it is to fight our way out. It takes a massive collective effort, and perhaps it finally took COVID-19 and 250,000 plus deaths to magnify and make clear the effects of self-centered delusion. What we have witnessed in the last 9 months is a macrocosm of what an abuse victim experiences psychologically: devaluing, bullying, threats, intimidation, coercion, gaslighting, dehumanization, subordination, calls for violence, and more, all the while held in place by an entire system devoted to the abusive leader. And there are plenty of people, particularly those in marginalized communities, who have felt the abuser's hand very directly in their lives. School bullying has reportedly increased under President Trump. The Trump DOJ narrowed the definition of domestic violence to only physical aggression in 2019, ruling out psychological aggression. The Trump administration has not reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, which had been partially credited for a 60% drop in reports of intimate partner violence from 1996 to 2010. This was out of their wish to uphold gun purchase rights for those convicted of acts of domestic violence who were no longer with that partner. Yet guns are a risk factor for intimate partner homicide. I might suggest the answer to getting out of our abusive family quagmire of extreme, antagonistic, tribalistic individualism is not divorce, but diverse. We have to become more related and consciously interdependent as a culture, embracing the strengths and challenges of our diverse society, which will only become more diverse in the years to come. COVID-19 has been a stressor, a destroyer, and a growth challenge. The hidden pandemic of intimate partner violence has been exacerbated. Reports on calls to hotlines are mixed. There are reports of increased calls and others reporting a 50% drop, likely due to the difficulty of making private calls during isolation. And it's hard to find substantial data on actual violence, but experts are expecting a significant increase in IPV and homicide because disasters in the past have exacerbated violence, and COVID underscores risk factors for domestic violence. Moreover, these risk factors are much worse for marginalized communities, so outcomes for domestic violence will likely be worse for minority communities, just as outcomes for other physical and mental health challenges are worse in the BIPOC communities. Isolation increases opportunity for psychological aggression, control, and coercion. Financial stresses are a known risk factor for domestic violence. Psychological stress is also a risk factor for domestic violence. There was an uptick in IPV during Hurricane Harvey, for example. 1 in 3 women and as mentioned, 1 in 10 men experience spousal abuse in their lifetime, and IPV cuts across all ethnic categories. I won't get into statistics of IPV in the Asian community because I resist creating overarching generalities about diverse groups of people. But significant violence is seen in all ethnic groups, though official numbers in the aggregate Asian American community are below whites. Of course, men have to be held accountable for aggression against women, and violence is totally unacceptable. Women's rights are human rights and have been denied for too long. But we also have to create space for men to come to terms with their own inner lives and emotions and their own histories of childhood trauma and abuse. Racism has disempowered and devalued BIPOC men in America, and this is an added psychological stress. We have to deconstruct racism, even as we deconstruct masculine entitlement to power. But men have emotions and are vulnerable, and the culture has not seen this. Psychologists have pointed to a friendship crisis among men, and men are often more isolated relationally than women. Less relational experience leads to worse understanding of how mutual relationships work. Anecdotally, the pandemic seems to be shifting the environment around men, allowing them more room for vulnerability and relationship. As a psychiatrist and humanist, I hope that we can all work to create an equitable society where all have access to the all-important human journeys of identity, belonging, and wellness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Our first question comes from Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta?
Thank you, Sunita. I think, Dr. Sandra, you said that while domestic violence cuts across all communities, it's less in communities of color than in white communities?
No, that in the official numbers in the Asian American community are about half of what is reported in white communities. But of course, we know there's a lot of underreporting, and there's great variation in smaller studies, which are not always scientific samples of different of spousal violence in the specific ethnic communities. So this is something that's still, probably needs to be studied a lot more. But I have a link to the Asian Pacific Islander Health Forum statistics in my ebook on domestic violence, which I can send you the link to.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Jaya Padmanabhan. Jaya. Jaya, are you there?
Yeah, I'm right here.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you for this very important topic. I just want to get a little more information on patterns. One of the most critical, especially in the Indian American community, was the Neha Rastogi case, which kind of gripped everybody because she was a woman of, she was an educated woman. She was working. She had resources, but yet, she was powerless in her house. So, could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have to beg your forgiveness because I don't know the details of this case, but I'm familiar with similar cases where within the household women feel disempowered and are unable to change their circumstances, and this is what I alluded to in living in a culture where women's voices are silenced, and there's often support for the abusive leader or the patriarch or the man of the house, so to speak, to be in his position, and it becomes hard to bring up an alternative narrative about what's going on. And I think, of course, psychologically, there's this element of codependency where partners can subordinate their own needs, even for safety, to other needs, to their partner's needs. And so there can be this cycle of kind of being in this enmeshed system where abuse happens, and not enough of a sense of how to break free of that pattern. Does that clarify things?
Yeah, and just to give you some background, Neha Rastogi was the Indian American woman who worked at Apple. She worked directly directly in view of Steve Jobs at the time. I'm sorry, there's some disturbance here, but yeah, you know, I think hers was a particular case that gripped the Indian American community as to how this was possible.
Yes, and just to add to that, the abuser got 15 days of a jail sentence after having abused his wife for 9 years. We have a question from Pierre, but I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Pierre Bejani. Pierre?
Hi, yeah, Pierre Bejani. I'm a publisher of the largest Arabic newspaper in Ohio. I would like to ask a question for Dr. Ravi. First, I do not appreciate your attack on the President Trump and telling him that giving all of these names about what he stands for and relating him to the violence abuse. I think that's totally irrelevant to what we're talking about here. We're talking about violence during domestic violence during this pandemic. We have seen a lot of rise into the pandemic in the Arabic Middle Eastern community during this pandemic. And do you have any explanation about that? And what is the approach to calm that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll take the second part of your question first because I think it's more significant. What's led to the increase? I think I alluded to it. We're talking about isolation leading to more chances for coercion to happen, and all the psychological forms of aggression can be amplified. There are stressors, financial stressors that can impact and heighten, particularly in marginalized communities. The financial stresses of COVID and the health stresses of COVID have hit marginalized communities even more. So clearly, if you're falling through the cracks already, this is going to expose difficulty, right? So that's in a nutshell. You know what's happening, and I think feeling marginalized is a psychological stressor, and I think this is why we have to talk about what happens to men. When men are marginalized, does for some men who've been perhaps, there's a complex history where some men have been abused and traumatized in their own childhood. So you can learn how, or a certain way of relating, which unfortunately takes its toll on the most vulnerable people in your group. So this is just a broad statement about trauma and abuse. And regarding the, I think I'm just, I think I'm very clear that I do not like abusive personalities. And to me, President Trump has been a clearly verbally abusive person who has amplified this very toxic way of relating to each other, where we're, again, compassionate.
Dr. Chandra, I'm so sorry. I wonder if we could just address a quick question from Oni before we have to move on. I apologize.
That's all right.
Oni, could you please ask your very important question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sunita. We always equate domestic violence with masculinity, that men over women dynamics. But we seldom discuss what in immigrant communities, some of the breadwinners are actually women. Specifically in the Filipino community, women nurses, when they immigrated to the United States, they are the breadwinners, and husbands, take care of the kids. So this role reversal could result, and we've seen this in the Filipino community, in domestic abuse, whether verbal or physical, against men, Could you talk about this from the perspective of men immigrants? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have a clear sense of the statistics about this, but sure. I mean, you know, we're talking about power. So, broadly speaking, so whoever holds power could be abusive. So this can happen if a partner has financial power. But I have certainly, I work with people in individual work and in couples, and I've certainly seen cases where men are psychologically intimidated and harassed and so forth by their female partner. So this happens, and I think so. This is why we have to talk about individual cases as well, and I think not and talk about power and what's subordinated with abusive power, which, as I said, compassion and common humanity. And we have to work on ways to bring people back to compassion and common humanity. And there's this, this gray area, I think, is like, how do you untangle a couple, if it can be untangled, from this pattern? And that's complex. Sometimes it does mean separating and finding safety and of course, and being safe from physical violence. But talking to a lot of people who work with partners, I think broadly, there are some cases where the pattern can change in the couple as well. So it requires a lot of effort, and that's why I think having an environment that's clear that abusive power is not acceptable, even especially at the leadership of a country, I think is very important.
Dr. Chandra, thank you very much for joining us on today's very important call. We really appreciate your presence here. We move on next to two women from the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office who are going to speak about resources that are available to victims and survivors of domestic violence in this current climate. Around the country, many court systems have had to largely curtail their services. And but here in Santa Clara County, as Hani Tran and Johanna Taivandat, and Joanna Taivandat will discuss what resources are available to women, both in from a criminal perspective and then in the civil courts. So Hani will start out with the criminal perspective. Hani?
Thank you so much, Sunita. And hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be here. As Sunita mentioned, my name is Hani Tran, and I'm a Deputy District Attorney here from Santa Clara County DA's office. During this briefing, I'll talk about three main points. The first is what DV victims with criminal cases against their perpetrators can expect from the criminal courts and the DA's office during the current shelter-in-place order. The second is resources available from our office to support DV victims during shelter-in-place. And then finally, how DV victims can seek protection through criminal protective orders. We know it can be so hard for DV victims to seek help, and there are additional barriers in our immigrant communities. So what I hope is that this information will demystify the criminal process, as well as relevant COVID-19 restrictions for DV victims if they are seeking help. First, I want to remind everyone that the first step for the criminal process to be triggered is when the police is called. It's oftentimes by the DV victim, but sometimes by a witness like a neighbor to a DV incident. Even in the midst of shelter in place, as Sunita mentioned, victims are still able to call the police to seek help, and criminal cases are still being filed and heard in criminal court. And that's because the police, the DA's office, and criminal courts are essential services that have been allowed to remain open. And that's been true here in Santa Clara County. Our criminal courts handling family violence cases have been open every day during shelter in place. Some types of hearings were initially delayed during the first few months of shutdown, including jury trials. Now, these were hearings that involved coordinating with more people like victims and witnesses. However, even these hearings have since resumed their pre-pandemic pace here in Santa Clara County. Note, though, that court functions do look different now than they did prior to shelter in place, and they've changed depending on how restrictive the public health orders have been in response to the rising COVID-19 numbers in our community. So for example, this week, in response to the surge in COVID-19 cases in our county, our Superior Court issued a new order that restricts the number of people or the types of parties that are allowed to even come into the courthouse. So for criminal court, the defendants, as well as the attorneys on both sides, and only witnesses and victims, including DV victims that have been subpoenaed for court, and that's the court order that requires them to show up for court. Their victim advocates can come as well as parents of minor victims may also appear. If DV victims go to court under subpoena, the same COVID-19 restrictions that you see elsewhere apply, including screening at the front so that you can't enter if you have COVID-19 symptoms, have to wear a mask, and practice social distancing. So for other hearings, the victims and the public at large may not attend in person. However, some courts, including here in Santa Clara County, have created options for victims to appear remotely if they aren't able to appear in person. The first is through video calls in the same way that we're doing here through Zooms or through Microsoft Teams. Courts are allowing victims to appear via the remote link. So for example, if the victim wants to provide input about the type of protective order that they want the court to issue, or if the victim wants to speak at the defendant's sentencing and tell the court about what he or she thinks should happen to the case, then they can do so via these remote links. The other option is through telephone, and that's through, here in Santa Clara County, we have public access telephone lines. Every court department has a number that the victim or the public can call into if they just want to listen into the proceedings in the same way in the past if you would just come to court and sit in the gallery and observe. Prosecutors and victim advocates from our DA's office, Victim Services Unit, have continued to be in touch with victims, meeting in person as needed and following all safety protocols, including masks and social distancing. And though we've also shifted to meeting virtually as well. Our Victim Services Unit is essentially a crime victim's connection to prosecutor, law enforcement, and our advocates also help victims have a voice in the criminal justice process because we know it can be very intimidating. Victim advocates can assist DV victims with applying for reimbursement for medical expenses and counseling, emergency assistance like finding emergency shelter, crisis support, and safety planning. Here in Santa Clara County, our DA's office Victim Services Unit have multiple language capabilities. In addition to English, we have Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin Chinese, and Russian speaking capabilities. We also have access to the language access line where a third-party service provider assists over the phone for other languages that we don't have sort of direct support for. I was also asked to talk a bit about criminal restraining orders and how victims can avail themselves to them during the pandemic. And there are two types that are triggered by the criminal process. The first is an emergency protective order. They're generally available once the police are called and when the officer or the victim believes the victim is in immediate or present danger of domestic violence. It's in effect for a very limited period of time and then they expire. Essentially, an officer makes an application based on his investigation, and that includes talking to the victim and collecting any corroborating evidence. The second type is criminal protective orders, and these are issued by the court hearing a DV criminal case. So there's two types of criminal protective orders: no contact order and peaceful contact order, and pretty self-explanatory there. But with no contact, you can't have any direct or indirect contact with the victim. And then peaceful contact must be peaceful contact, cannot molest, strike, threaten, stalk, sexually assault, batter, harass, or in any way disturb the peace. So that includes verbally assaulting the victim. The court does take into account the victim's input for the criminal protective order. And again, the victim may provide input by making a statement to the court at the time the court issues the protective order. Generally, the victim's oral statement to the court is sufficient, but the court may review any additional evidence. The court may review the police report, hear input from the DA, who may discuss any prior DV that he or she is aware of, as well as the defendant's violent history, and also take input from the defense attorney as well. A few final points as a general matter, whether here in Santa Clara County or elsewhere. If you are a victim of DV, seek help. If not from the police, because again, we know it can be a very intimidating process, reach out to a DV service provider to seek that help, right? But let's say a criminal case is filed, I encourage DV victims to just be in close touch with the DA on the case, as well as the victim advocate, right? Again, the criminal justice system can be really difficult to navigate for anyone, and it's even more difficult now in the time of changing COVID-19 restrictions, right? When you can go to court, when you cannot. So you don't have to do it all alone. You don't have to know it all. Just be in touch with your victim advocate or your DA. They'll keep you apprised of the changing restrictions. And finally, we know that DV victims may also require immigration and legal services for immigration and family legal services in addition to their criminal case. So in that case, I encourage victims to seek out family justice centers in your jurisdiction, which are one-stop shops for DV victims to access those holistic services in one location. We have 2 here in Santa Clara County that are currently open for in-person services in San Jose and Morgan Hill, and I'll send that info to everyone in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Hani. I want to mention that both Hani and Joanna's comments are a bit localized. So we encourage reporters to go out into your own communities and find resources, find out what your DA's office is doing. So, Hani, I'd like to start out with a question myself. Many domestic violence advocates have said that during this time, it's very difficult for victims to actually access court services, given that there's no safe place for them to make that phone call or get on that Zoom link. Could you talk about how victims in such circumstances can actually access your services?
Sure. Here in Santa Clara County, our victim advocates through our office are able to help the victim access those links or make that call here in our office. If they don't have a safe place at home, they can come into our office, and then our victim advocates can find can book a conference room, so there's enough room for everyone to socially distance, and they'll help the victim pull up the Zoom or Teams link and access the technology. The court can be particular about when you can be unmuted, or like you can be muted most of the time. So the victim advocate can help the victim along and prompt the victim as to when to unmute to speak. Similarly, I think for making the phone call to listen into court, if they need a safe space, they can come to our office and the victim advocate can help them, guide them through the technology. Sunita, you're on mute.
Thank you. We will go on to Joanna, and I suspect there are going to be a number of questions after Joanna speaks for both of you. So we'll move on to Joanna next, who will discuss the process of, in part, obtaining a restraining order in the civil court, family courts. Joanna?
Okay, thank you so much. It is an honor to be with you all today. So yes, greetings from Santa Clara County. I'm Joanna Tai Van Dad. I'm actually the lead attorney at the Self-Help Center. So not with the district attorney, but the family court. So civil court. And so thank you to Hani for covering a lot of what the local rules are. And I'm going to talk to you about what happens when the police is not involved or when there's not a criminal case where a victim wants to seek protection for herself or himself, right? And so in terms of the civil restraining orders, there are different types of restraining orders. So the first one, domestic violence, that means that the person requesting the restraining order has to have a relationship that falls under Family Code 6211. So that means first degree or second degree familial relationship or dating relationship, intimate partner. So that would fall under domestic violence. Now, if it's a relationship outside of that, so there's a table of consanguinity I can send out also so you know which relationships fall under which, but outside of a dating relationship or a close family relationship, it would be considered civil harassment. And so that could be, for instance, a neighbor, a coworker, or niece or nephew. So with the protections are a little bit different. In the domestic violence restraining orders, there are orders also for custody and visitation, if that's applicable. There's requests for move-out orders, whereas in civil harassment, there would not be support orders or custody and visitation orders. Another type of civil restraining order will be an elder abuse or a dependent adult. So someone 65 or older could come to court and seek protection from being physically abused, financially, mentally, or emotionally abused, neglected, abandoned, isolated, or deprived by a caregiver of services to avoid harm or suffering. So because of the restrictions with the pandemic and everything, what was really important for our court is to remain open the whole time of the shelter in place for victims of domestic violence to come in and seek in-person assistance. For all other non-emergency issues, the court changed the self-help services to remote. So we would answer the phone lives, we have live chat, we have remote video conferencing. We continue to offer day of court services, but remotely, but we wanted to make sure that for victims of domestic violence, for people that needed emergency custody visitation, emergency guardianship issues, or nowadays with the evictions, kind of being an emergency because of the pandemic and the different rules, the litigants can come in directly to the court to get services. So to give you an idea, when the customer comes in, and we call them customers, I should say, because although I'm an attorney, I work for the court, we help both sides, right? So we will help the person seeking the assistance and then also the person who wants to respond to their restraining order. So we'll help and in a neutral way, provide legal information, but not legal advice. So we can explain the law, tell them what to expect, but we're not gonna be representing them in court. It's very different from a traditional attorney-client relationship. So what's important to note is that when people come in, we wanna ask them, first of all, what is the relationship between you and the person you're seeking to restrain? And that will determine which forms we give them. And so the way our office has found it helpful is to provide people with the form packet that they need to fill out, along with a sample that walks them page by page through all the forms to make it a little bit easier to navigate, right? And then the thing that's really important is, as Hani mentioned, there is, if a criminal protective emergency order was granted, sometimes people come to civil court so that there's not a lapse, something doesn't expire, right? And they still have the protection. So we'll talk to them about when they file, they're asking for emergency orders that will protect them until the court hearing. Now, typically, the court hearing happens within 21 to 25 days, but because of the emergency orders, that has been expanded, so they could last 30 days or 90 days until the court hearing, depending on the situation. So if, for instance, the victim comes in and has children with the alleged perpetrator, the custody and visitation orders can be the temporary orders as well. And if those orders are for no visitation, the court is going to set a sooner hearing than for people that don't have children. So I hope that that makes sense. So what's really important for them to know is, yes, they can come in person, they can access our resources that way. And then we help them through their declaration to understand how to present the information to the court, because it's just a written declaration. There's not necessarily the opportunity to present evidence per se, but they can definitely include text messages or pictures, things like that. But what's really important in the declaration is to paint a clear picture for the judicial officer who's going to grant this temporary order within 24 to 48 hours. So it's a really quick turnaround time for the restraining orders, temporary restraining orders. So that covers the domestic violence restraining order. Civil harassment, different standard, right? And that is heard over in civil court. So in Santa Clara County, it's just across the street from the family courthouse. And the elder abuse restraining orders are also heard in civil court. So those are the things that I wanted to let you all know about. And again, I can only speak to Santa Clara County, but yes, I would encourage everybody for other areas to look at the hotline, National Domestic Violence Hotline. So the number you should know is 1-800-799-7233, or it would stand for 1-800-799-SAFE, SAFE. And the website would be thehotline.org. And that would give you access to what locally is in your area. So the courts, as Hani said, have been proactive in making sure that people have access in a way that's safe, given the COVID-19 protocol. So yes, there is a conference line they can call into. There is remote hearings, video appearance. So that way they don't have to worry about having to find childcare, for instance, or wear a mask. They could do it in where they are at and participate in the hearing that way. There is also domestic violence advocates that are available to help them as a support person. in court. And then similarly to what Henny said, we do have access to Vietnamese and Spanish in Santa Clara County are the most common languages outside of English. For anything else, we can order interpreters. And one of the silver linings through this is because everybody's used to appearing remotely, we have been really successful in accessing other languages through a language line. So are there any questions?
A couple of questions have come up about immigration status. Nissan asks, what is your response to immigrants who are experiencing domestic violence but are afraid to come forward due to fear of revealing their immigration status? And Henrietta, you had a similar question about the number of people that come through who may be undocumented. So if both of you could answer those concerns, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So I'm sorry. I was just going to say for our, we never ask people about, documentation or immigration status when we provide the services. So that is something we want to make sure that the community knows that they can come in and pick up the paperwork. We're not going to ask them about any of that. And then as Hanyi mentioned, with the family justice centers, it's really great because it is that one-stop shop where they can get legal advice from an immigration attorney and possibly file for different visas if they qualify for protection.
I echo what Joanna said, similar with our criminal process and our police partners and our DA's office. We do not inquire about victims' legal status. If we do happen to find it out, we do not disclose that information. So we want all crime victims, including DV victims, to feel like they can seek help because no one deserves to be a victim of a crime, regardless of their immigration status.
Yeah, and if you could just, maybe state to potential victims who are immigrants, how to, overcome their hesitancy towards seeking help.
It's so hard. I think we do try to do outreach for our immigrant communities, but we know there's so many barriers. There could be stigma unique to each immigrant community. I'm myself am Vietnamese, and so I grew up sort of knowing and seeing some of these barriers where we don't want others to look poorly upon our family, right, or even our community, right? And so, but what I encourage is I remind people about the generational impact of domestic violence, right? About how children who grow up witnessing abuse oftentimes become perpetrators or victims themselves. And so they want to break that cycle of generational violence. It's so difficult, but it's so important to seek help, if not from the police, because I know there's so many barriers to even being to connect with the police, but from DV service providers, nonprofits. In our county, we have amazing nonprofits who are so connected and embedded in our communities, right? And there's these amazing networks of survivors who are supporting one another, helping them find jobs, right? Or helping them have a place to stay. And so it's so hard, but yeah, I mean, we're never going to break the cycle of violence if we don't speak up and speak out.
Absolutely. Araceli has a question about the possible increased numbers of Latinos who are coming through for help. Araceli, could you ask your question?
Hi, thank you. I just wondering if you have information about Latinos and domestic violence that I don't know if with COVID-19 we have seen an increase of in the number of cases. I don't know if you have some information about it.
So Araceli, I sent you a link to the National Domestic Violence Hotline report. Oh. That's more of, I think, national numbers. And so I don't know what jurisdiction you're from, but that might be helpful for you. I'll say locally, we have heard from our nonprofit, our DV service providers, that they've gotten an increase in calls and requests for services during the pandemic. We ran numbers, we requested numbers from our largest police department here in Santa Clara County, and that's the San Jose Police Department. And their numbers show an increased number of call outs, so calls for domestic violence. And the data they gave us was for the first 6 months of shelter in place. Our office unfortunately hasn't run that data yet because we kind of wait until the end of the year to kind of see how many cases we have as a whole. So unfortunately, I don't have that data from our office, but I hope that data that I provided from the National DV Hotline, as well as generally from our DV service providers and our local police department, is helpful.
Thank you both for joining us on this very important call. We really appreciate your comments. And again, I would like to encourage reporters to seek out what resources are available in your communities. It is so important to get these resources out to your readers at this critical time. So we next move on to Fawn Jade Kaur. She's a senior staff attorney at Bay Area Legal Services. Fawn is going to discuss how the court system and law enforcement sometimes fails victims of domestic violence. Fawn, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. So I guess I'll touch a little bit on starting with the court system. When shelter in place first began, I'm personally in the San Francisco office of Bay Area Legal Aid. We do have offices all over the Bay Area, and we're the largest provider of civil legal services in the Bay Area as well. But I'll speak specifically to San Francisco County. That's the county that I work in. So when shelter in place first began, we did have a lot of barriers to accessing the court in the beginning. Mostly it was for unrepresented litigants, which means people that don't have an attorney and people who do not speak English. So for them to access the Access Center or court services and obtain any advice or any help or information or paperwork, they had to speak English in order to access those services, because the phone number, the voicemail, and the individual who answered the phone was only an English-speaking individual. So those were barriers to access. In addition, there's just been significant delays. Everything takes longer. Court hearings were pushed out significantly. DV survivors don't just need protection in the form of restraining orders. I also represent survivors of domestic violence in their divorce cases, child custody cases, child support cases, and immigration cases, certain immigration cases related to domestic violence survivors, affirmative cases only. And in some of those instances, a survivor might need access to income or finances, might need an enforcement motion, and courts were not hearing all of those matters. So a lot of survivors were delayed in receiving any adjudication on their cases. Some are still waiting today, and some, we believe, who didn't have attorneys maybe stopped trying to access services. If they didn't have an attorney helping them, the barriers were insurmountable, and we don't know how many people are without help and services because they didn't even know how to access it. And I think there's just a very important distinction to be made for people who have attorneys and people who don't have attorneys. We do offer free legal services to low-income individuals in the Bay Area, but we can't help everyone. There's only 2 staff attorneys in the family law unit in San Francisco. And so, services can be limited even though we do offer free legal services. So, calls also went up recently, but, I looked at our statistics in preparation for this interview, and they completely vary from March to December. There was a significant drop in early March, and up until June or July, numbers went up in June and July. They went down a little bit in the early fall, and they're up again. So it really seems to vary. I agree that I think survivors probably had trouble accessing services by making a confidential phone call. But it does seem clear that the numbers are not consistent in terms of being up or down. So I think we just need to look at that and maybe review that at the end of the year and try to come up with ideas around what was happening in the community and how we can best respond to that as legal service providers moving forward, since we're unclear what 2021 brings in terms of shelter in place. So we'd like to be able to help the members in the community moving forward in the most appropriate way possible during this pandemic. I think other ways in which the court system and law enforcement, in my opinion, have been failing survivors is we don't have adequate implicit bias training for bench officers. We don't have adequate implicit bias training for officers that respond to the scene in domestic violence cases. I think it's really important for there to be this kind of mandatory training for judicial officers and for all police officers. Culturally sensitive responses to survivors of domestic violence is critical. Some people who are undocumented are of course not going to feel comfortable sharing the details. Some individuals from different cultures are comfortable sharing details in a different manner than in another culture. And I think that the bias that survivors encounter when they enter the courtroom is significant and affects everyone's case. That's a long-term issue. That's not specifically a COVID issue, but it is significant, ongoing, and I think progress needs to be made if we really are going to help survivors of domestic violence in the community. I have to be honest, most of my cases are not prosecuted. My clients file police reports and no prosecution is ever pursued. My clients typically don't end up feeling that they have the support from the police department when they report TRO violations, or when they report domestic violence incidents and are seeking enforcement of some kind, whether that be removing the abuser from the household, an arrest, or a criminal case if that's what they're choosing. My clients don't typically report responsiveness from the police department in those respects. So those are challenges that I think we're seeing in terms of accountability. There's not necessarily a position that all cases should be prosecuted or that we're advocating in general for a criminal case to be open, but in the instances where a client expresses the desire to have a criminal case proceed, it is not always the case that they have the assistance of moving forward with a criminal case. And I guess last to add, I think the Family Justice Center model is wonderful, but some counties don't offer that. So again, just check in your county. For instance, San Francisco does not have a Family Justice Center, but we do have a variety of nonprofits that are all very interconnected and provide unique legal services in different areas of the law and in different fields. We have a wonderful relationship with the DA's office and the SFPD officers and the sheriff's office. We're all in communication with each other to best help survivors, but not every county has the same model. So it would be good to just check for each client to check, or each individual in a community to confirm.
Thank you so much, Fawn. I'd like to start the Q&A with a question for both Fawn and Hani. There were two very prominent cases that came through within the Indian American community. First, the case of Gurbaksh Chahal, who had beat up his girlfriend 147 times. A detective obtained CCTV footage from his own bedroom, and yet he was given, I believe in the first instance, parole. He violated parole and then got a sentence of a year, but he was allowed to go on and appeal that sentence. And then finally he did serve time, but he only served 6 months. I'm wondering, in that case, some might say that the court clearly failed the victims, both the victims. And I wonder, I'll ask this question of both of you, what types of evidence does one need to have a successful criminal prosecution in these types of cases?
I'll defer to Hani. I'm a civil law attorney. I only represent clients in the San Francisco Superior Court or other counties in the Superior Court. I don't practice criminal law.
Okay, all right,
Sure.
Hani.
I'll take this. So we know that DV cases, as with a lot of family violence cases, can be very difficult because they happen behind closed doors. So it's often one person's word against another. And so, and we do know that the testimony of any one person can prove a case, but when you're putting the case, let's say, in front of a jury of 12 people, and you have to prove that very high bar in a criminal case of beyond a reasonable doubt to convince them that this occurred. What the jury requires and what the jury requires to sort of believe one or another is corroborating evidence that this happened, right? And so what the police are often looking for and what our prosecutors are often looking for is any corroborating evidence to corroborate that this abuse happened, right? So that could be documentation of injuries, right? So when the police shows up at the scene, that's why they're taking photos of injuries that happen. If there was prior abuse that happened, if the victim documented and took her own photos, it's important to provide that to the police officer. Sometimes, and I agree with Fawn's point about how our law enforcement as a whole can we be so much more culturally responsive to our victims, to our DV victims, right? And so oftentimes our victims think, oh, they're here just to talk about this one incident that happened today, and then they don't feel comfortable talking about everything that happened in the past. But if they talk about everything that's happened in the past, that's relevant for the DA to consider when they're filing charges as well. They'll want to look at any messages or other evidence that shows the past controlling or abusive behavior. So whether there were text messages or emails that shows that abusive behavior, all that helps corroborate what happened and paints a picture of what happened. So all that's very important.
I guess I just wanted to add a little bit of a response in terms of maybe not in the criminal context, but just in the civil of what you need to show that you'd like the relief that you're seeking. And I think everything that Hani stated is accurate, but the problem that I see is that it depends on who the litigant is. Who is the survivor? Is she a white woman asking for protection, or is she a woman of color? Is she someone from a culture who is not comfortable talking about sexual abuse in open court in front of a bunch of male judicial officers? Or is it a Black woman whose credibility is always going to be questioned more sharply than any other intersectional identity? So I think it's really important, not just what do you need to show, but who are you and who's asking for protection? Because I do think the response differs depending on who you are, both with the police department and with all judges.
That is a very important point, Fawn. Thank you for bringing that up. And thank you, Hani. We have another question. What would you say to victims who want help but don't want to criminalize their partners?
I think if the client wants protection in the form of a civil restraining order, which I have to remind clients all the time, it's a piece of paper. It doesn't involve a criminal component, and it doesn't involve any criminalizing. And so that would be one route to take. I typically tell my clients that opening up a civil restraining order case shouldn't have any criminal consequences, especially if the other person is a US citizen, and no police report has been filed and the police haven't been contacted in any way. It probably won't have any criminal component at all. That's usually my advice.
Interesting. Hani, do you have any response?
I'll also say that at least in our office, we recognize that oftentimes the relationship still exists after the criminal case is over. So we recognize that, we're one piece of it, and our goal is to hopefully equip both sides with tools so that after the criminal case is done, that it's a safe relationship, right? And so, for example, let's say the perpetrator is convicted and he or she is put on probation. As part of like the DV probation terms, they're required to do like a batterers intervention program, anger management, and so forth. And so we're hoping that some of the requirements that comes as a part of sentencing will help address some of the violence that's happening in the relationship so that it doesn't continue to happen even after the criminal case is over.
Thank you. And Joanna, here's a question for you. Some women do not want to leave their partners. They just want the abuse to stop. And what advice would you give to victims?
So generally, that's what I explain to them, that when they file for the restraining orders, the temporary order is going to last until the court hearing. And so at least it'll give them some time, right, to kind of see how things can cool down and they feel safe, right? And so we also talk to the victims if they want to change, for instance, the level of restriction. So let's say at the initial point, they wanted a full, peaceful contact, but also stay away order just for protection. At the time of the hearing, they can ask that it be changed to a peaceful contact. And we'll always have them talk to an advocate about it so that they know all of their options and do safety planning, because we explain to them that it's really important for them to be safe and their children. Like Hani mentioned, the generational cycle and how we know that witnessing domestic violence for the children, even if they didn't see it or they just heard it, it can cause a lot of trauma. And we know now about adverse childhood experiences. So also one of the things I wanted to talk about is kind of stress like the importance of healthy relationships and modeling that, and what would that look like. So when we talk with like communities, for instance, yes, Hani and I both met at a community outreach for the Vietnamese community, right? And so we didn't want to present it as, oh, let's talk about domestic violence, because no one would come, because of the stigma, because they don't want to talk about it. So we presented it as, what does a healthy relationship look like? What kind of conversations, how do we address conflict, but not in a way that it was threatening to them, or to like talk about, things that have so much stigma behind them. And it's very important to, save face in our community, right? So I think presenting it as a way of living in a modeling healthy relationships, that those are safe, respectful, they're kind, right? And so that extends to their immediate circle, but then also outward. So in all relationships, whether there's domestic violence, civil harassment, how do we move forward? Kind of Dr. Chandra talked about, the compassion and like relating to one another and finding that common point. So I know for a lot of people, especially if they have children together, they don't want the other party, the other parent to be incarcerated or to have any repercussions for their like job situation or something like that. But to really stress, this could be temporary to give you the resources you need to be able to move forward in a way that is safe and healthy.
Absolutely. Is there any evidence that courts have denied restraining orders during this time of COVID because the defendant has no place to go?
I don't have any personal experience with cases of that nature, but I do think that there is a problem that we can see in this scenario. In a domestic violence restraining order in the civil court, you have the right to ask for a move-out order. Well, for a while there was a moratorium on moving in the Bay Area. So how do you effectuate that? And how do you effectuate a move-out order if there is nowhere else to go, right? We have a moratorium on, or had a moratorium on evictions for this very reason. Although a move-out order isn't one, it does present logistical challenges. And I'm sure the courts have had to grapple with that, and certain clients have had to deal with that.
Well, thank you all. Sandy, any final remarks before we end?
Just to say that what I think we all know is that this topic has such a stigma in so many communities. People are afraid to talk about it. So you have helped open the conversation. And this is so valuable. I want to thank each of our speakers for your time and for helping us just start a conversation which is so complex, we can't do justice to it. All we can say is it's a process, and you really have helped us get into this topic, which is a real priority for us over the coming months. Thank you very much.